Long before anyone laid out the streets of Mohenjo-daro, long before merchants pressed carved seals into wet clay, and long before standardized bricks appeared across an astonishing stretch of South Asia, there were villages at the edge of mountains and plains. There were no great cities yet. There was no civilization that archaeologists could call Harappan. There were communities learning, generation after generation, how to remain in one place, how to cultivate crops, how to manage herds, how to store food, how to build in mud brick, and how to connect themselves to landscapes that could be both generous and unforgiving. And if we want to understand the Indus Civilization, this is where the story has to begin. Not with its mysterious script, not with the Great Bath, not with the famous seals, but with thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. Around the 7th millennium BCE, communities were living at Mehrgarh, near the Bolan Pass in present-day Balochistan, Pakistan. Mehrgarh is one of the most important early farming sites known in South Asia. Its position mattered. To the west and northwest rose routes leading toward the Iranian plateau and Afghanistan. To the east stretched the plains that ultimately connected with the Indus Basin. Mehrgarh therefore stood near a meeting point between ecological zones, and the archaeological record preserved there reveals an exceptionally long sequence of human adaptation. Some of its earliest inhabitants cultivated wheat and barley. They raised sheep, goats, and cattle. They built structures for mud brick. They stored food. They buried their dead. They fashioned ornaments from materials that had sometimes traveled considerable distances before reaching the settlement. None of this should be mistaken for the Indus Civilization already existing in 700 BCE. It did not. The mature urban civilization associated with Harappa and Mohenjo-daro lay thousands of years in the future. What Mehrgarh reveals instead is a deep background from which later societies in northwestern South Asia emerged. Farming itself transformed what communities could become. A mobile hunting and gathering group could possess elaborate traditions and sophisticated knowledge. But settled agriculture created different opportunities and different pressures. Fields demanded repeated attention. Stored harvests needed protection. Animals needed management. Permanent buildings required maintenance. Growing populations had to negotiate access to land, water, and labor. Surplus could support people whose work was not entirely devoted to obtaining food. Over centuries, those conditions could encourage specialization. The archaeological sequence at Mehrgarh records precisely the kind of slow transformation that becomes almost invisible when ancient history is told only through kings and wars. Pottery appeared and developed. Craft production became increasingly sophisticated. Beads and ornaments were made with growing skill. Copper was eventually used. Terracotta figurines appeared. There is even remarkable evidence for prehistoric dental drilling at Mehrgarh, where tiny drilled holes in human molars demonstrate an extraordinary degree of technical ability. This was not urban civilization, but it was not simplicity in the dismissive sense either. These communities were building a repertoire of techniques and social practices that their descendants and neighboring populations could develop further. And Mehrgarh was not alone. Across Balochistan, Sindh, Punjab, and neighboring areas, archaeological cultures developed distinctive pottery, settlement forms, and craft traditions. Places such as Kili Gul Muhammad, Rana Gundai, Omri, Khatdiji, Ramandari, and many others reveal that the road toward urbanization did not pass through a single ancestral city. It passed through a landscape crowded with local experiments. That fact is essential. The Indus civilization did not suddenly appear because one ruler founded an empire. There is no evidence for such an event. Instead, archaeologists can watch regional traditions becoming increasingly connected. And over the 4th millennium BCE, that process accelerated. Settlements expanded. Crafts became more specialized. Long-distance exchange intensified. Certain architectural practices became more organized. Communities obtained shell from coastal areas, stone from distant sources, metals from or bearing regions, and attractive minerals such as carnelian and lapis lazuli through networks that crossed difficult terrain. Long before the streets of Mohenjo-daro were paved, people were already learning how to move materials through a vast world. Some settlements also developed walls or fortifications. Kot Diji, in present-day Sindh, is particularly important because occupation there predates the mature Harappan phase. Its archaeological sequence helped scholars identify what is often called the early Harappan period. Farther north, Raymondari, in present-day Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, displays an unusually ordered settlement plan during the pre-urban centuries. In Rajasthan, Kalibangan preserves evidence of a plowed field with intersecting furrows visible archaeologically. That discovery provides an extraordinary glimpse of farming itself. We are not merely finding sickles or grains and inferring agriculture. At Kalibangan, the land preserved traces of the way cultivators physically organized a field thousands of years ago. Yet there was still enormous regional diversity. Different communities produced different ceramics. They arranged settlements differently. Their economies responded to local environments. One region could not simply impose its solutions on another. A farmer near the Indus floodplain confronted a different landscape from a community living in arid Kutch. A settlement near the Makran coast had access to maritime resources unavailable to a village deep inland. Communities beside seasonal watercourses faced problems unlike those beside more dependable rivers. The later strength of the Indus civilization would lie partly in its ability to connect these different landscapes without making them identical. Between approximately 3,300 and 2,600 BCE, during what archaeologists commonly call the early Harappan period, signs of greater integration become increasingly visible. Settlements grew. Some became fortified. Pottery traditions interacted. Specialized manufacturing expanded. Exchange networks reached farther. And symbolic marks appeared that may belong to the developmental background of the later Indus script. Something profound was occurring. For generations, communities that had once been primarily local were becoming participants in networks spanning enormous distances. That did not mean political unity had already been achieved. Indeed, whether the mature civilization was ever politically unified in anything resembling an empire remains uncertain. But economic and cultural convergence was unmistakable. Then, around 2600 BCE, the archaeological record changes with startling speed. Across much of northwestern South Asia, a recognizable package of practices spread and intensified. Cities expanded dramatically. Standardized bricks became common. Standardized systems of weight appeared. A distinctive script was used. Characteristic seals circulated. Urban drainage systems became sophisticated. Craft technologies reached extraordinary levels of refinement. And settlements stretching across an immense region participated in what archaeologists identify as the mature Harappan civilization. This is the civilization commonly called the Indus Valley Civilization. But even its modern name can be misleading. It was never confined to the Indus Valley. Its settlements stretched far beyond the river and its tributaries. They appeared across much of present-day Pakistan and northwestern India, with connections reaching into Afghanistan and toward the Iranian borderlands. Sites existed in Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan, Haryana, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and beyond. Its geographical footprint exceeded that of Egypt or Mesopotamia, considered as individual early Bronze Age cultural zones. And yet, for all that size, we still do not know what the inhabitants call their civilization. We do not know what they called Harappa. We do not know what they called Mohenjo-daro. We do not know what language or languages most of them spoke. We do not know the names of their political leaders. We cannot read their inscriptions. In one of history's strangest reversals, we can walk through the drainage systems of their cities more easily than we can enter their thoughts. The modern term Harappan comes from Harappa, one of the first major sites recognized by archaeologists. Harappa lies in Punjab, Pakistan, near the Ravi River. The settlement had roots extending into earlier periods, but during the mature phase it became a major urban center. Much of ancient Harappa suffered severe damage long before modern archaeological protection. Its baked bricks were quarried, including during 19th century railway construction. Countless ancient walls were effectively turned into ballast beneath colonial railway tracks. What survived was still enough to transform history. Archaeologists identified large mounds containing residential districts, craft areas, walls, streets, drains, cemeteries, and structures whose original functions are still debated. And that last qualification matters. Early excavators frequently attached confident names to structures they did not actually understand. Large buildings were called granaries. Raised sectors were called citadels. Certain objects were interpreted immediately as religious. Modern scholarship is often more cautious. A building that looks suitable for storage may have served another purpose. A raised walled area does not necessarily mean a military citadel. An unusual object is not automatically a ritual object. The Indus Civilization continually punishes certainty. Then there is Mohenjo-daro. Located in Sindh, Pakistan, Mohenjo-daro became the most famous Indus city because of the extraordinary preservation and scale of its archaeological remains. Its surviving streets revealed deliberate organization. Brick houses stood along lanes and larger thoroughfares. Numerous wells supplied water. Bathing areas were incorporated into houses. Wastewater could pass through drains built into an extensive urban system. Some drains were covered. Inspection points allowed maintenance. Some could trap solid waste. The engineering was not identical in every neighborhood or at every point in the city's history, but taken as a whole it represents one of the ancient world's most impressive commitments to urban water management. This matters because sanitation is easy to overlook when imagining ancient power. A pyramid can be seen from kilometers away. A drain disappears beneath the ground. Yet a drain requires planning. It requires gradients. It requires bricks. It requires construction and maintenance. It requires households and public spaces to relate to one another according to shared expectations. And Mohenjo-daro contained drain after drain after drain. The civilization's priorities had literally been built under its streets. Many houses opened toward courtyards rather than presenting elaborate facades to major roads. Some had staircases indicating upper floors. Some possessed their own wells. Bathing floors were carefully constructed to direct water toward drains. Entrances were sometimes positioned in ways that created privacy from the street. The result was an urban environment strikingly different from the monumental royal landscapes familiar from Egypt and Mesopotamia. That does not mean Indus society was egalitarian. Differences in house size, access to resources, occupations, ornaments, and burial treatment demonstrate social variation. It means something more limited and more intriguing. The civilization has not yet yielded unmistakable royal palaces, gigantic royal tombs, or monuments covered in declarations celebrating named kings. That absence is real. Its interpretation is not settled. Perhaps political authority was distributed among corporate groups. Perhaps powerful merchants, landholders, ritual specialists, or councils governed cities. Perhaps rulers existed but expressed authority differently from Egyptian pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings. Perhaps some buildings we currently classify incorrectly were elite residences or administrative centers. And perhaps the undeciphered script contains names and titles that would radically change our understanding if it could ever be read. For now, the rulers remain invisible, not necessarily because there were none, but because the evidence does not allow us to identify them. Nothing demonstrates this mystery better than the contrast between Mohenjo-daro and contemporary Egypt. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already centuries old when mature Harappan urbanism flourished. Its size proclaimed royal power. Its funerary context pointed toward kingship. Hieroglyphic texts, later monuments, and an enormous body of evidence allow historians to reconstruct dynasties. In Mesopotamia, rulers commissioned inscriptions celebrating temple building and warfare. Cities raised monumental religious architecture. Kings wrote themselves into memory. At Mohenjo-daro, there is silence. No giant face overlooks the city. No surviving inscription announces, "I built this wall." Instead, what survives is collective infrastructure. And in the elevated western sector of Mohenjo-daro stands one structure that has fascinated generations of archaeologists: the Great Bath. It is a carefully constructed rectangular tank, approximately 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, with steps descending into it. The brickwork was made water-resistant, and surrounding rooms formed part of the architectural complex. A nearby well may have supplied water. A drain allowed the tank to be emptied. Nothing about it looks accidental. Considerable labor went into creating a controlled body of water in a prominent urban location. What happened there? We do not know. Calling a ritual bath is reasonable but still interpretive. It could have been used for ceremonies involving purification. Its use may have been restricted to particular groups. It could have hosted communal events. Water clearly mattered deeply to Indus urban life, practically and perhaps symbolically. But without readable texts, the Great Bath preserves its architecture while withholding its meaning. This pattern repeats everywhere. We possess the object. We lack the explanation. A small bronze figure discovered at Mohenjo-daro, conventionally called the Dancing Girl, captures another side of the civilization. She stands with one hand at her hip, wearing numerous bangles. The figure is only about 11 centimeters tall, yet the casting technique demonstrates sophisticated lost wax metalworking. The familiar nickname is modern. We cannot know whether she was intended as a dancer. Her identity, purpose, and significance remain unknown. Another famous sculpture, a a small stone male figure traditionally called the priest king, is equally deceptive. The man's half-closed eyes and patterned garment inspired an interpretation connecting him with priestly authority. But there is no inscription calling him either priest or king. The title survives because archaeology sometimes becomes trapped by its earliest labels. He might have represented an elite individual. He might have had ritual significance. He might have been something no modern category captures well. His calm stone face has become an icon of a political system we still cannot identify. Beyond Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, the civilization becomes even more interesting. It was not simply a pair of giant cities controlling identical provincial copies. Settlements adapted to local geography. Rakhigarh, in present-day Haryana, India, was one of the largest Harappan urban complexes known. Ganarwala, in the Khalistan region, appears to have been another major center, although it remains less extensively excavated. Kalibangan developed along the Gagar system. Lothal flourished in Gujarat. Dholavira rose on Kadir Island in the Rann of Kutch. Each belonged to the same broader civilization. Each was also distinct. Dholavira is perhaps the clearest demonstration that standardization never meant mindless uniformity. The city occupied a demanding environment. Water availability could not simply be taken for granted. Its inhabitants responded with engineering on a remarkable scale. Channels directed runoff. Reservoirs stored water. Large stone-lined basins became integral components of the settlement. Where cities such as Mohenjo-daro are famous for brick, Dholavira made extensive use of stone. Its urban organization also differed. Fortified sectors divided the settlement into multiple zones. Gateways, large open spaces, reservoirs, and substantial architecture created an urban form that was unmistakably Harappan, yet distinctly local. Dholavira demonstrates a principle running throughout Indus history. Shared civilization did not erase adaptation. It provided a framework within which communities solved local problems. And at Dholavira, one of the most astonishing objects associated with the Indus script was discovered. Near a gateway, archaeologists recovered 10 large signs, constructed from pieces of a light-colored material, which had apparently formed part of a prominent display. Most Indus inscriptions are tiny. They appear on seals or small objects designed to fit inside the hand. These signs were different. They were meant to be seen. Whatever they communicated was publicly displayed on an architectural scale unusual in the Indus world. Perhaps it was a name, perhaps a title, perhaps an institutional designation. Without decipherment, we cannot say, but their existence destroys one tempting assumption. Indus writing was not necessarily confined to miniature administrative objects. At least occasionally, it entered monumental public space. Then there is Lothal. Located in Gujarat, Lothal was deeply connected with craft production and wider exchange. A large brick-lined basin, there became famous as the dockyard. For decades, it was frequently described as one of the world's earliest engineered docks. That interpretation remains influential, and the site's proximity to ancient waterways makes maritime use plausible. But scholars have debated the basin's exact function, with alternatives involving water storage or irrigation. The safest conclusion is that Lothal was connected to regional and maritime exchange, while the precise interpretation of the basin remains debated. What is not controversial is Lothal's importance as a manufacturing center. Bead makers worked materials such as carnelian. Shell workers transformed marine resources into ornaments. Standardized weights linked economic transactions to systems recognized far beyond the settlement. Warehousing or storage facilities stood near areas of commercial importance. Artifacts tie Gujarat to networks extending around the Arabian Sea. To appreciate those networks, we have to imagine the Indus Civilization not as a static map, but as constant movement. Farmers moved harvests. Herders moved animals. Fishers worked rivers and coasts. Craft workers acquired raw material. Merchants or transport specialists carried commodities between settlements. Boats traveled waterways. Pack animals crossed land routes. Bullock carts rolled along tracks. And ships crossed portions of the Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf. The wheel was familiar. Terracotta models of carts survive. Images and models provide glimpses of transport technology. Rivers would have offered enormous advantages for moving heavy goods, though ancient river courses differed from modern ones. Across this network circulated stone, shell, timber, metals, food, textiles, finished beads, and countless perishable products archaeology can barely detect. Standardized weights made this world measurable. Harappan cubical weights are among the civilization's most distinctive administrative technologies. Often made from carefully selected stone, they followed systematic weight relationships. Their geographical distribution reveals a shared metrological tradition. A merchant or official operating hundreds of kilometers from another major city could nevertheless encounter recognizable standards. That did not happen by coincidence. Someone taught these standards. Someone reproduced them. Someone expected other people to accept them. Here again, invisible institutions reveal themselves through ordinary objects. The same is true of bricks. A commonly used mature Harappan brick proportion was approximately 1:2:4 in thickness, width, and length. Not every brick across every century followed the rule perfectly, but the recurring ratio across distant sites demonstrates strong conventions. Think about what that means. There was no internet, no printing press, no central handbook surviving in thousands of copies. Yet builders across immense distances repeatedly produced compatible forms. Standards traveled through people. Knowledge moved through apprenticeship. Institution maintint expectation. Traditions themselves could govern behavior. The Indus Civilization's political mystery, therefore, should not distract us from something archaeology establishes beyond much doubt. This society possessed considerable organizational capacity. You cannot build and sustain large cities without it. You cannot maintain widespread measurement systems without it. You cannot produce intricate craft goods for long-distance exchange without it. You cannot obtain raw materials from mountains, deserts, plains, and coasts without networks capable of coordinating movement. The question is not whether the Harappans were organized. The question is what form that organization took. And until their writing can speak, that question remains open. Their script is the greatest barrier between us and them. Thousands of inscribed objects are known. Most inscriptions are frustratingly brief. Some contain only a few signs. Even relatively long examples remain tiny compared with Mesopotamian tablets or Egyptian monumental texts. Researchers generally identify several hundred signs, though the exact count depends on whether variants are treated as distinct characters. Many inscriptions appear to run from right to left, inferred partly from sign placement and crowding. Certain signs recur in patterns. Some appear preferentially at particular positions. That regularity is one reason many researchers consider the inscriptions linguistic writing. But there is a minority scholarly position arguing that the signs may represent a non-linguistic symbol system. The debate persists because the decisive evidence is missing. There is no Indus Rosetta Stone. No bilingual inscription gives an Indus text beside a known language. There is no securely identified alphabet. There are no long royal chronicles. There are no surviving libraries. And most importantly, we do not know the underlying language. A Dravidian language or language family has often been proposed. Other hypotheses have been advanced. None has achieved a decipherment accepted by the relevant scholarly community. That distinction is crucial because claims of decipherment appear regularly. A researcher assigns sounds to signs. A sequence suddenly seems to produce recognizable words. Headlines announce that the mystery has been solved. But a genuine decipherment must work beyond a handful of examples. It should explain sign behavior systematically. It should predict readings. It should account for grammar. It should survive testing by independent specialists. It should not depend on repeatedly changing values whenever an inscription refuses to cooperate. No proposal has yet cleared that bar, and so the seals remain silent. Yet their images communicate something even if their inscriptions do not. A great many show animals. Zebu bulls appear. Elephants appear. Rhinoceroses appear. Water buffalo appear. Tigers appear. There are composite creatures. Most famously, there is the so-called unicorn, a creature depicted in profile with what appears to be a single longhorn. The unicorn motif is extraordinarily common. It often faces an object, sometimes described as a ritual stand or offering device. We do not know why. It might have marked institutions, social groups, identities, deities, occupations, myths, or combinations of meanings unavailable to us. The repetition shows significance. Its exact significance is lost. One particular seal has attracted more religious interpretation than almost any other Indus object. It shows a horned or headdress wearing central figure seated in a distinctive posture with animals around it. The archaeologist John Marshall famously connected it with Shiva in the form of Pashupati, Lord of Animals, and later writers sometimes presented it as a proto-Shiva. That identification is possible only in a very broad comparative sense. It is not established. Thousands of years separate the mature Indus civilization from much of the later evidence through which Hindu traditions are understood. Similar-looking imagery does not automatically prove continuous identity. The responsible conclusion is therefore more fascinating than the confident one. The seal probably depicts something meaningful. It may involve ritual, divinity, authority, or myth. But we cannot name the figure. Female terracotta figurines raise similar problems. Older scholarship regularly called them mother goddesses. Some may indeed have had fertility or religious meanings. But figurines can serve many purposes. They can be votive objects. They can be household religious objects. They can be toys. They can represent ordinary or extraordinary people. They can have functions that change according to context. Without text or sufficiently clear archaeological associations, calling every female figurine a goddess tells us more about older archaeological assumptions than about Harappan religion. What we can say is that figurines form part of material life. People shaped human bodies from clay. They represented animals. They created miniature carts. Children almost certainly played with at least some small objects. Adults wore ornaments. People decorated themselves with beads and bangles. They combed or arranged hair. They wore cloth, much of which has disappeared because textiles rarely survive. Cotton is particularly important. The Indus region preserves some of the world's early evidence for the use of cotton textiles. Spindle whorls reveal spinning. Impressions and rare fibers help confirm textile production. A civilization famous today for brick and stone wooden life have been full of fabric, wood baskets, mats, ropes, painted surfaces, food, smoke, animals, vegetation, human voices, and smells. Almost all of that vanished. The ruins are therefore a skeleton of the civilization, not the civilization itself. Imagine entering Mohenjo-daro at its height. The first impression would not have been archaeological brown. Buildings may have been plastered. Doors would have been made of wood. Clothing brought color into streets. Potters carried vessels. Carts moved loads. Animals occupied urban spaces. Smoke rose from hearths. Water was hauled from wells. Someone swept a courtyard. Someone argued over a transaction. Someone repaired a drain. Someone drilled a bead. Someone prepared grain. Someone watched a child. Someone pressed a seal into clay. Someone recognized the signs instantly. The city was not mysterious to them. Every object that puzzles us belonged to a world of common knowledge. The famous unicorn did not need an archaeological paper to explain it. People knew what it meant. The inscription on a seal was not an undeciphered script. It was information. The Great Bath was not an archaeological interpretation. It was a place with a purpose. The tragedy and fascination of Harappan archaeology is that the people who possess the explanations are gone, but fragments of their daily routines remain. Their diet varied by environment. Wheat and barley were important. Pulses, sesame, dates, and other plant foods were consumed. Millets became important in some regions. Rice is attested in parts of the broader Harappan world, particularly toward eastern and southern zones, though its role varied. Animals included cattle, sheep, goats, buffalo, and pigs. Fish contributed significantly in some communities. Wild animals were hunted. The enormous geographical spread of the civilization makes any single Harappan diet misleading. People living along the coast ate differently from people living inland. Farmers in Gujarat cultivated under conditions different from farmers in Punjab. Seasonality mattered. Local ecology mattered. Agriculture itself was cleverly adapted to environmental diversity. The popular image of ancient civilizations often assumes monumental canal irrigation. For the Indus Civilization, the evidence is more complicated. Farmers exploited seasonal inundation, rainfall, local water control, wells, reservoirs, and other methods depending on location. Large Mesopotamian-style canal networks are not the defining feature of the civilization. At Dholavira, water harvesting became extraordinarily important. Elsewhere, farmers could take advantage of river floods and soil moisture. The result was not one agricultural system, but many related strategies. That diversity may have contributed to resilience. If one crop struggled in one ecological zone, another could succeed elsewhere. If one region specialized in a raw material, another could exchange for it. Urban civilization rested on rural knowledge. For every dramatic city excavation, countless farmers and herders remain archaeologically anonymous. They produced the calories that kept specialists alive. They raised the cattle that pulled carts and plows. They grew fibers used in textiles. They supplied grain to urban communities. They moved between villages and markets. They transformed floodplains into productive landscapes. Without them, there would have been no Harappa, no Mohenjo-daro, no bead-making industries, no overseas commerce. The true scale of the Indus Civilization therefore lies not merely in its great cities, but its settlement network. Large cities interacted with smaller towns. Towns interacted with villages. Specialized production centers operated near raw materials or routes. Pastoral groups moved through landscapes that permanent architecture does not adequately record. Ports and coastal settlements connected inland economies with the sea. And on the outer edges of this enormous system, Harappan communities reached farther than a modern viewer might expect. At Shorchagai, in northern Afghanistan, archaeological evidence reveals a settlement associated with the Harappan cultural sphere. Its location placed it near routes leading toward the lapis lazuli sources of Badakhshan and the wider networks of Central Asia. Whether it functioned specifically as a trading colony in the modern sense should be treated carefully, but its existence demonstrates the reach of Harappan connections. To the southwest, maritime routes brought Indus traders into contact with communities across the Persian Gulf. Mesopotamian texts provide the closest thing we possess to an external written window onto this civilization. They mention a land called Meluha. Most scholars identify Meluha with the Indus region or an area closely associated with it. Texts speak of Melian goods and people. Materials connected with Indus trade appear in Mesopotamia. Indus-style seals have been discovered there. Carnelian beads produced with characteristic techniques traveled west. Mesopotamian records refer to commodities including exotic woods, ivory, and precious materials moving through long-distance networks. And one document mentions a Meluha interpreter. That tiny detail is extraordinary. An interpreter exists because people cannot understand one another. Somewhere in the Bronze Age world, speakers associated with Meluha encountered Mesopotamian speakers often enough that translation became useful. Behind that administrative reference lies a human meeting we can almost see. A traveler from the east arrives in a foreign city. The buildings look different. The language sounds unfamiliar. The gods have unfamiliar names. Weights, contracts, customs, and expectations differ. Goods must be evaluated. Prices must be discussed. And someone who understands both worlds steps between them. This is where the Indus Civilization escapes the stereotype of an isolated mystery. It belonged to the Bronze Age international world. Ships and coastal craft linked the Indus sphere with Makran, Oman, Bahrain, and Mesopotamia through networks involving intermediate ports. Dilmun, associated particularly with Bahrain, became an important Gulf trading center. Mehrgarh, generally associated with Oman and neighboring regions, supplied copper and participated in maritime exchange. Meluha stood farther east. These regions did not necessarily trade only through direct voyages between their furthest points. Goods could move through intermediaries. A bead might pass through several hands before reaching a Mesopotamian elite. A metal ingot might travel through multiple ports before becoming a Harappan tool. The objects moved farther than most individuals ever did. Carnelian reveals the sophistication involved. Harappan craftspeople produced exceptionally fine beads, including long barrel-shaped forms requiring difficult drilling. Etched carnelian beads used chemical and heating processes to produce pale designs against reddish stone. These artifacts required expertise accumulated through apprenticeship. A failed drilling attempt could destroy valuable material. A successful artisan understood stone properties, heat, abrasives, drill technology, and patience. Specialized workshops reveal organized production. At places such as Mohenjo-daro and Lothal, craft activity became a major feature of settlement life. Faience added another technological achievement. Harappan artisans manufactured glazed compositions used for beads, bangles, small objects, and decorative pieces. Copper and bronze workers cast tools, vessels, figurines, and other objects. Gold and silver were used for ornaments. Shell workers transformed conch and other marine materials. Stoneworkers manufactured standardized weights. Potters produced vessels in enormous quantities. The civilization was an ecosystem of knowledge, and knowledge had to be taught. Every beautifully drilled carnelian bead implies a teacher. Every accurately constructed drain implies learned practice. Every standardized weight implies agreement. Every inscription implies someone who understood a sign system. Education need not resemble a modern school to be real. A child could learn beside a parent. An apprentice could learn inside a workshop. A merchant could learn signs and measures through practical training. A builder could internalize proportions through repetition. A ritual specialist, if such specialists existed, could memorize ceremonial knowledge orally. The absence of school buildings tells us almost nothing about whether knowledge was systematically transmitted. The civilization endured because it transmitted knowledge successfully for generations. Its political order remains more difficult to recover. Earlier interpretations sometimes imagined priest kings. Others suggested merchant oligarchies. More recent work often emphasizes heterarchy, corporate organization, or multiple forms of local authority. But no single model has one universal acceptance. What does the evidence actually require? It requires coordination. It requires institutions capable of organizing labor. It requires accepted standards. It requires dispute management. It almost certainly requires inequalities of authority and access. It does not require that a single emperor controlled the entire Harappan world, nor does it prove that every city was an independent democratic republic. Those are modern categories forced onto incomplete evidence. The mature civilization may have consisted of several political entities sharing an extraordinarily strong cultural and economic system. Its cities may have been governed differently from one another. Authority could have rested in groups rather than individual monarchs. Political power may have been intentionally less monumental than elsewhere, or archaeological evidence for its most visible symbols may simply be missing. There's another warning hidden in the architecture. Baked brick survives. Wood does not. Mud brick erodes. Textiles disappear. Paint fades. Metal is recycled. If elite power was displayed through carved wood, banners, elaborate textiles, furniture, ceremonies, clothing, or ephemeral structures, archaeology would preserve only a faint shadow. Absence of a stone palace is therefore not proof of absence of hierarchy. The same caution applies to warfare. Compared with several contemporary civilizations, the Harappan archaeological record does not emphasize military kingship. We do not see long, carved battle scenes. There are no known inscriptions boasting of slaughtered enemies. Weapons are not the civilization's defining artifacts. But this does not mean Harappan society experienced no violence. Fortifications existed. Projectile points and weapons existed. Human skeletons occasionally show trauma. Communities everywhere have conflict. What we lack is evidence that conquest and warrior kingship dominated Harappan public ideology in the manner visible elsewhere. That difference alone is significant. Burials add another layer. Harappan cemeteries generally lack anything comparable to the royal tombs of Ur or the pyramidal burials of Egyptian rulers. Some people were buried with pottery and ornaments. Grave treatment varied. Social distinctions existed. But the extraordinary concentration of wealth in a handful of gigantic tombs is missing. Again, there are several possible explanations. Elites may not have invested wealth in burial. Mortuary rituals could have involved practices leaving little archaeological trace. Status during life need not map directly on his status in death. Some bodies may have been treated in ways that survive poorly. The archaeology allows us to say that known Harappan burial customs did not monumentalize individual rulers on the Egyptian scale. It does not allow us to declare society classless. In fact, bioarchaeology complicates idealized portrayals of Harappan urban life. Earlier narratives sometimes described Indus cities as exceptionally peaceful, clean, healthy, and egalitarian. The drains and wells encouraged a romantic picture. But skeletons preserve evidence of disease, nutritional stress, dental problems, injury, and interpersonal violence in some contexts. Urban sanitation was impressive for its time, but no Bronze Age drainage system turned a dense city into a modern public health environment. People still encounter pathogens. Water could become contaminated. Animals lived near humans. Insects carried disease. Food supply fluctuated. Women faced the risks of pregnancy and childbirth. Injuries could become infected. A city of tens of thousands was an extraordinary human achievement, but it was not a utopia. That makes its engineering more impressive, not less. The inhabitants were solving problems that never disappeared completely. They invested heavily in water and waste management because water and waste mattered. At Mohenjo-daro, wells were extraordinarily numerous. Households and neighborhoods had repeated access to groundwater. Bathing installations occur frequently. Drains channeled wastewater. These features suggest cultural practices in which washing was important. Whether ritual purity was involved cannot be established merely by projecting later South Asian traditions backward by 2,000 years. Continuity is possible. Proof requires more. The same methodological problem shadows nearly every attempt to connect Harappan religion directly to later Hinduism. There are tempting similarities. Bathing and purification matter greatly in later South Asian traditions. Sacred trees occur in both. Certain animals have enduring symbolic importance. A seated figure can appear suggestive of yogic practice. Lingam-like stones have been claimed. Female figurines have been compared with goddess worship. Fire installations at Kalibangan and elsewhere have been compared with later Vedic ritual. But resemblance is not identity. Cultures can independently attach significance to water, trees, fertility, fire, and animals. Traditions can also survive while changing meaning radically. The Indus Civilization undoubtedly influenced later South Asian populations through demographic and cultural continuity. Exactly which religious ideas survived and in what form cannot yet be demonstrated with confidence. That uncertainty becomes even more important when the civilization begins to change. For centuries, mature Harappan systems had linked cities and villages across enormous distances. Then, during the later 3rd millennium BCE, stresses accumulated. By around 2200 BCE, parts of the wider Old World were experiencing major climatic shifts. A period often associated with increased aridity affected regions from northeastern Africa through western and southern Asia in different ways. For the Indus world, paleoclimate evidence indicates significant changes in monsoon patterns over the long term. But no single drought on a single day destroyed the civilization. The transformation took centuries, and different regions experienced it differently. That is the first key to understanding the fall of the Indus civilization. There was no single fall. Mohenjo-daro was not burned to the ground by an invading army on the last day of Harappan history. Harappa did not receive a command that civilization was over. Dholavira did not collapse at the exact moment Lothal changed. Instead, the urban system unraveled unevenly. One pressure came from changing hydrology. Rivers are not permanent lines painted on landscapes. They migrate. They flood. They abandon channels. They capture tributaries. They accumulate sediment. And Northwest South Asia contains one of the world's most dynamic river environments. The Gagor-Hakra system has become central to debates about Harappan settlement. Many settlements occurred along or near now dry channels in the broader region. Older theories often imagined a huge perennial river disappearing abruptly and destroying Harappan civilization. Modern geological work has produced a more complex picture. Major Himalayan rivers, such as the Sutlej and Yamuna, change courses over long geological timescales, with important avulsions occurring before or outside the mature urban period. Parts of the Gagor-Hakra landscape during Harappan times may have depended heavily on monsoonal flow and local hydrology rather than a single mighty glacier-fed river identical to the river described in some older reconstructions. As monsoon strength declined, water availability could become less reliable. That would affect crops. It would affect settlements. It would affect routes. And people responded. That response is visible in changing settlement geography. Populations increasingly shifted toward smaller communities and toward regions where rainfall and water resources offered different opportunities. Urban concentration diminished. Settlement expanded or intensified in some eastern areas. Gujarat followed its own trajectory. The civilization fragmented into regional cultures. And that tells us something critical. People did not disappear. Cities declined. Institutions disappeared. Standards weakened. But population survived. Another pressure involved trade. Mesopotamia itself underwent political and economic transformations. Persian Gulf trade patterns changed. Long-distance networks connecting Meluha with Western markets declined. That would have affected specialized industries dependent on distant consumers or raw materials. If a workshop produced luxury goods for exchange across hundreds or thousands of kilometers, contraction of that network could have devastating local consequences. A bead maker cannot eat beads. An urban specialist survives because agricultural surplus and market systems allow specialization. When those systems shrink, people change occupations or move. Standardization also weakened. The famous seals became less common. The script disappeared. Weights changed. Brick proportions were no longer followed with the same widespread consistency. Distinctive regional pottery traditions emerged. These changes are more informative than an imagined battlefield. They show institutions losing reach. A civilization held together by shared conventions was becoming localized. The process is visible at major cities. Later occupation at Mohenjo-daro included construction less respectful of older street plans. Infrastructure was modified. Buildings were reused. Urban organization changed. Harappa also continued through transformations rather than simply being abandoned in a single event. At Dholavira, phases of occupation and decline reveal local responses over time. Different cities reach their endpoints differently. Flooding may have posed recurring problems at Mohenjo-daro. Water scarcity challenged Dholavira. Changing waterways affected trading settlements. Declining exchange altered craft economies. Climate pressure modifiait agriculture. No single explanation works everywhere because there was no single Harappan environment. For much of the 20th century, however, one explanation captured the public imagination: invasion. When excavators discovered human skeletons at Mohenjo-daro, they were once interpreted as victims of a final massacre. This idea became connected to the arrival of Indo-Aryan-speaking groups and to passages in the Rig Veda describing conflicts and the god Indra destroying forts. A dramatic narrative emerged. Aryan invaders swept into the Indus world, destroyed its cities, and replaced its civilization. The story was memorable. It was also unsupported by the archaeological chronology in that form. The supposed massacre remains at Mohenjo-daro do not demonstrate a single city-wide slaughter ending the civilization. The mature urban system was already undergoing profound transformation before the period usually associated with Indo-Aryan language dispersal into South Asia. There is no archaeological layer across Harappan cities showing simultaneous destruction by an invading army. The old invasion model, therefore, does not explain the urban decline. This does not mean migration did not occur. It did. Linguistics, archaeology, and ancient DNA have transformed the discussion. Indo-Aryan languages belong to the Indo-European language family and are historically related to Iranian languages and, more distantly, to Greek, Latin, Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, and many others. The Indo-Iranian branch developed from populations with cultural connections extending into Central Eurasia. During the second millennium BCE, Indo-Aryan-speaking populations entered and interacted with South Asia. Genetic studies have identified ancestry associated with steppe pastoralist populations entering South Asia during the second millennium BCE after the mature Indus urban phase. But migration is not the same thing as a single military invasion causing Harappan collapse. The chronology matters. Urbanization and migration were overlapping historical processes in a changing post-Harappan world, not one simple scene of conquerors toppling Mohenjo-daro. Ancient DNA has also provided a tantalizing glimpse of ancestry connected with the Indus cultural sphere. Obtaining usable ancient DNA from South Asia is exceptionally difficult because heat and environmental conditions damage genetic material. Nevertheless, genetic research, including an individual associated with Rakhigarhi and individuals from sites outside the Indus region who appear genetically connected to Indus-related populations, has helped refine models of population history. The results suggest that people associated with the Indus Civilization descended substantially from ancient populations related to Iranian plateau hunter-gatherer ancestry and deeply rooted South Asian hunter-gatherer ancestry, without the later step ancestry that became important in subsequent populations. The details remain an active research area, but the broad picture reinforces what archaeology had already suggested. South Asian population history involved mixture, migration, continuity, and transformation over immense periods. No civilization was replaced as though one population vanished and another materialized overnight. As the mature cities declined after roughly 1900 BCE, regional cultures became increasingly visible. Archaeologists use terms such as late Harappan, Cemetery H, Jukar, and Rungpur traditions to describe some of these developments. These labels represent archaeological patterns, not necessarily self-conscious ethnic groups. That distinction matters. A new pottery style does not automatically mean a new people. A changed burial custom does not prove an invasion. Material culture can shift because trade changes, beliefs evolve, populations mix, or communities choose new identities. At Harappa, Cemetery H preserves mortuary practices and pottery differing from the mature urban phase. Elsewhere, communities continued older practices while abandoning others. Some regions saw continuity in settlements. Others experienced dispersal. Long-distance standardized systems weakened. Local traditions strengthened. And sometime during these centuries, the Indus script ceased to be used. That loss may be the most consequential event of all for modern historians. Imagine if even one Harappan archive had survived. A merchant's accounts, a ritual text, a list of rulers, a collection of laws, letters between cities, a hymn, a treaty, a school exercise, a map, a shipment record containing recognizable place names. Anything long enough to provide linguistic leverage. We might know what language the script recorded. We might know whether Harappa and Mohenjo-daro belong to the same political state. We might know whether the unicorn represented a deity, guild, household, or something completely unexpected. We might know what the Great Bath was called. Instead, writing vanishes with the urban institutions that had sustained it. Why? Perhaps because the script was primarily associated with administrative networks that no longer operated. Perhaps literacy belonged to specialized groups whose social positions disappeared. Perhaps writing continued on perishable materials for a time and escaped archaeology. Perhaps regionalization removed the economic advantages of maintaining a standardized sign system. Whatever happened, there is no securely demonstrated continuous line from the Indus script to later Brahmi writing, which appears more than a millennium later. That gap is enormous. The post-urban communities nevertheless carried countless forms of knowledge forward. Farming continued. Cattle raising continued. Pottery continued. Village survivait. Trade continued on altered scales. Craft techniques persisted or evolved. People who had lived inside the Harappan cultural world became ancestors, biological and cultural, of later South Asian populations. This is why disappearance is the wrong word. Civilizations are institutional arrangements. People are people. An urban system can cease to exist while descendants of its inhabitants continue living in the same broad region. And the distinction changes how we understand the end. Around the second millennium BCE, the center of some settlement patterns gradually shifted eastward. This process was neither instantaneous nor caused by one migrating group. The Ganges-Yamuna region would eventually become a major center of population, agriculture, and state formation. But that later transformation unfolded over centuries. The earliest Vedic texts belong to a very different historical archive from Harappan archaeology. The Rig Veda was transmitted orally in an Indo-Aryan language, Vedic Sanskrit. Its hymns reveal pastoral wealth, cattle, horses, chariots, ritual sacrifice, clans, chiefs, priests, conflicts, rivers, gods, and poetic cosmology. Its world cannot simply be laid directly over the ruins of Mohenjo-daro. The two represent different cultural systems in partly different periods, yet they eventually belong to the same evolving subcontinent. The communities whose descendants carried Vedic traditions interacted with descendants of populations already living in South Asia. Languages borrowed words. Populations mixed. Agricultural knowledge crossed cultural boundaries. Ritual practices evolved. Social structures changed. Over centuries, entirely new cultural syntheses emerged. Some older narratives try to turn this transition into a clean binary. Harappan versus Aryan. Urban versus pastoral. Indigenous versus foreign. Defeated versus conqueror. Real history was more complicated. People marry across boundaries. Children grow up bilingual. Migrants adopt local foods. Local populations adopt new animals, technologies, words, and rituals. New elites arise. Old identities dissolve. Memories change. After several centuries, categories that once looked separate no longer describe reality. The later history of South Asia emerged from precisely this kind of complexity. We should also be careful with another attractive idea. It is tempting to search later Indian civilization for specific Harappan survivals and declare victory whenever something looks familiar. A bathing tradition becomes proof of the Great Bath's religious meaning. A later deity becomes the identity of a seal figure. A sacred tree becomes evidence of an uninterrupted cult. A fire ritual proves what a Harappan installation was used for. But 3,000 or 4,000 years is enough time for symbols to change completely. Continuity almost certainly existed at many levels. Demographic continuity alone makes some cultural inheritance likely. The challenge is identifying it rather than assuming it. Sometimes the most scientifically responsible sentence is also the most frustrating. We do not know. The Indus Civilization contains many such sentences. We do not know its language. We do not know its rulers. We do not know its political boundaries. We do not know how most seals were read. We do not know exactly what its most famous religious-looking images meant. We do not know what the inhabitants called themselves. But ignorance should not obscure the enormous body of things we do know. We know their builders understood standardized construction. We know urban water management was highly developed. We know craftspeople mastered difficult technologies. We know farmers cultivated diverse crops in varied environments. We know communities lived in cities of considerable scale. We know goods moved over enormous distances. We know merchants or intermediaries interacted with the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamian world. We know writing or a highly structured sign system formed part of administrative and symbolic practice. We know traditions were shared across a region of extraordinary size. And we know the mature urban system transformed rather than being annihilated in one apocalyptic event. Then, for more than 3,000 years, the cities themselves largely disappeared from historical memory. Mohenjo-daro sank beneath accumulated deposits. Harappa became mounds. Dholavira stood in a remote landscape. Bricks remained underfoot, while the civilization that made them ceased to have a known name. Later peoples occupied the wider region. Kingdoms rose. Empires formed. Religions developed. Languages changed. Alexander's armies crossed the Indus. The Mauryan Empire expanded. Buddhist and Hindu traditions transformed South Asian intellectual life. Islamic polities appeared many centuries later. Mughal emperors ruled. European trading companies arrived. The British Empire expanded. And all the while, beneath fields and mounds, the remains of a civilization older than most of those histories waited. The first modern observers did not understand what they were seeing. In the 19th century, travelers reported ancient mounds at Harappa. Charles Masson, an extraordinary and controversial traveler who had deserted from the East India Company's army, visited Harappa and described its ruins during the 1820s and 1830s. Ancient bricks were visible. Walls and mounds suggested substantial occupation, but there was no chronological framework capable of placing the site correctly. That problem persisted. Alexander Cunningham, who became the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, examined Harappa in the 19th century. A seal bearing an unfamiliar inscription was eventually published. Its strange signs and animal imagery should, in retrospect, have been revolutionary. But an isolated object cannot announce its own date. Cunningham did not recognize a Bronze Age civilization. And while archaeology hesitated, destruction accelerated. Railway construction in the 19th century consumed enormous quantities of ancient brick from Harappa. Workers and contractors had little reason to imagine that these regular baked bricks came from one of humanity's earliest cities. For them, the mound was a convenient quarry. Every cartload removed architecture. Every brick reused elsewhere erased context. One of archaeology's recurring tragedies is that ancient building materials are often most useful precisely because they were made so well. Then, in the early 20th century, the puzzle finally began to assemble. The Archaeological Survey of India carried out excavations at Harappa. Daya Ramsani led important work there beginning in 1920. At Mohenjo-daro, recalled as Banerjee, also known as our D. Banerjee, recognized ancient remains whose artifacts showed striking connections with Harappa. Under the Director Generalship of John Marshall, the significance of the discoveries became undeniable. Seals from separate sites displayed the same strange script. Pottery and artifacts belonged to the same cultural world. The architecture was ancient, very ancient. In 1924, Marshall announced the discovery to a wider audience. South Asian history had just become dramatically deeper. Before these excavations, scholars knew that the subcontinent possessed an ancient past, but nothing had prepared them for a Bronze Age urban civilization contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro demonstrated that sophisticated urban life flourished in South Asia during the 3rd millennium BCE. The discovery redrew maps of early civilization. An excavation continued. Mohenjo-daro revealed the Great Bath. Harappa revealed its extensive settlement and cemeteries. More seals emerged. Weights accumulated. Beads, figurines, pottery, copper objects, shell, and brick architecture filled museum collections. But the first generation of excavation also introduced interpretations later scholars would question. Archaeology itself has a history. Excavators bring assumptions. They compare unfamiliar structures to things they already know. A large building becomes a granary because grain storage seems plausible. A substantial male sculpture becomes a priest king because Mesopotamia had priestly and royal elites. An elevated zone becomes a citadel because fortified high places are familiar from elsewhere. Female figurines become mother goddesses because early archaeologists regularly applied that label across prehistoric societies. Then later generations return to the evidence and ask whether those names were ever proven. That process is not a failure of archaeology. It is how scholarship improves. Calibangan expanded understanding eastward. Lothal demonstrated the importance of Gujarat and maritime connections. Surkotata, Banawali, Rakhigarhi, Farmana, Mohenjo-daro, and numerous other settlements complicated the map. Dholavira transformed understanding of Harappan urbanism by revealing monumental water management and stone architecture in Kutch. In Afghanistan, Shorchagai demonstrated northern reach. In Khalistan, surveys identified dense networks of sites along ancient channels. The civilization grew larger with every decade of research. Even calling it the Indus Valley Civilization became increasingly awkward. Many settlements lie outside the Indus Valley proper. For this reason, archaeologists often use Harappan Civilization or Indus Civilization in a broader sense. Thousands of Harappan-related sites have now been reported, though exact counts vary because databases use different definitions and because many sites belong to early, mature, or late phases rather than representing full mature urban settlements. Most were never giant cities. That is exactly the point. A civilization is not composed only of capitals. Its villages matter. Its camps matter. Its production sites matter. Its ports matter. Its seasonal settlements matter. Its roads and rivers matter, even when they leave little trace. Modern science has also changed what can be extracted from ancient remains. Radiocarbon dating refined chronology. Archaeobotany identified seeds, grains, and agricultural strategies. Zooarchaeology reconstructed animal use. Isotope analysis can reveal aspects of mobility and diet. Residue analysis can identify substances once held in vessels. Remote sensing helps locate buried features. Geomorphology reconstructs ancient rivers. Paleoclimate records reveal changing monsoon patterns. Ancient DNA, when preservation allows it, illuminates ancestry and migration. Microscopic, where on tools can reveal how they were used. The Indus Civilization is no longer studied only by digging walls. Its history is being reconstructed grain by grain, tooth by tooth, molecule by molecule. And each new method makes the civilization simultaneously clearer and more complicated. Consider climate. A generation ago, a simplified story might have said that a river dried up and the civilization collapsed. Today, researchers examine speleothems from caves, marine sediment cores, lake deposits, flood histories, pollen, and river geomorphology. The picture suggests long-term weakening or reorganization of monsoon systems interacting with highly dynamic river landscapes. But environmental change does not mechanically dictate human behavior. Two communities can experience the same drought differently. One has reservoirs, another migrates. One changes crops, another intensifies pastoralism. One maintains trade connections, another loses them. The decline of Harappan urbanism, therefore, became a history of adaptation as much as environmental stress. Dholavira makes this especially vivid. Its inhabitants lived somewhere water had to be captured with extraordinary care. Reservoirs were not an optional civic luxury. They were survival infrastructure. Channels took advantage of seasonal flows. Stone architecture responded to available material. The city's very existence demonstrates that Harappans could maintain major settlements outside the easiest floodplain environments. Eventually, however, even sophisticated adaptation has limits. If environmental, economic, demographic, and institutional pressures combine over generations, maintaining a large city can become less advantageous than dispersing into smaller settlements that may be close to what happened across parts of the Harappan world. Urbanism is not an inevitable stage from which humanity never retreats. Cities exist because particular economic arrangements make them possible. If networks change, people can rationally leave. Deurbanization is not necessarily evidence that people forgot how to build cities. Sometimes the social reason for sustaining those cities has disappeared. Think of a Harappan merchant family living near the end of the mature period. Their grandparents may have used standardized seals in transactions stretching across regions. Their workshops could obtain specialized stone from distant sources. Their cities' drains were maintained under conventions generations old. Their weight system made distant exchange predictable. Then conditions change. A Western customer network contracts. A river route becomes unreliable. A source of raw material becomes harder to access. Harvests become less predictable. Relatives migrate eastward. An urban neighborhood loses population. Fewer specialists can be supported. A workshop closes. A seal is no longer useful because the institution that recognized it has disappeared. The next generation moves to a smaller settlement. Their children still know how to make pottery. They still raise cattle. They still cultivate grain. They may remember stories about the old city, but they never learned the script. One generation later, the signs have become meaningless. This specific family is hypothetical, but the broad process is archaeologically plausible. And it illustrates something that the word collapse hides. Civilizations can disappear one habit at a time. A measurement is no longer standardized. A drain is repaired differently. A distant supplier stops arriving. An inscription is no longer carved. A public building is converted to another use. A family leaves. A neighborhood contracts. A city becomes a village. A village becomes a mound. And then nobody remembers the city's ancient name. That is far closer to the Indus ending than armies pouring through burning gates. The absence of a dramatic final battle may be why its decline feels so modern. Complex systems can be enormously resilient until the relationships sustaining them become harder to maintain. Then decentralization can occur without any person deciding that civilization should end. The Harappans did not wake up one morning around 1900 BCE and discover that history had classified them as late Harappan. They adapted to their immediate circumstances. The archaeological phase boundary exists in our chronology, not in their lived experience. This is also why dates should be treated as ranges rather than magical dividing lines. The mature Harappan phase is commonly placed around 2600 to 1900 BCE. That does not mean every city became mature in 2600 on the same day. Nor did every mature tradition disappear in 1900. Regional sequences overlap. Local chronologies differ. Archaeological periods are tools for describing gradual historical processes. Before 2600 BCE, urban characteristics had already been developing. After 1900 BCE, Harappan traditions persisted. History refuses the clean edges we draw around it. One particularly interesting question is whether Harappan political organization itself contributed to resilience and eventual fragmentation. If authority was highly distributed, that might explain both the absence of monarchic monuments and the remarkable autonomy of regional centers. Shared standards could have spread through networks without a territorial empire. Cities could participate in the same commercial and symbolic system while being politically distinct. Such an arrangement might be flexible during stable conditions. But when long-distance networks contracted, there may have been no central state capable of forcing the system to remain integrated. That remains a hypothesis. Another possibility is that powerful institutions existed, but expressed themselves through forms archaeology has not recognized. The undeciphered script leaves both possibilities alive. One day, a discovery could change everything. Imagine archaeologists uncovering a sealed chamber in an Indus settlement. Inside are dozens of copper plates bearing long inscriptions. Among them is an imported Mesopotamian object with a translation. Suddenly, sign values become testable. Names emerge. Titles appear. Cities can be identified. The civilization moves from archaeology toward textual history. Such discoveries are possible in principle. But after a century of excavation, none has appeared. Until then, restraint is part of the story. Some mysteries should remain mysteries rather than being filled with invented certainty. And that is particularly important for the civilization's religion. It is easy to transform Harappan symbols into a prehistory of later faiths. It makes the story feel continuous. But the actual accomplishment of the civilization is more interesting than forcing it to become something familiar. Whatever Harappan religion was, it was Harappan. Its practitioners understood symbols we do not. They may have worshipped gods whose names disappeared completely. They may have practiced ancestor rituals. They may have associated water with purity. They may have venerated particular trees and animals. They may have had myths embodied in the unicorn seals. There may have been household traditions varying from city to city. There may have been professional ritual specialists. There may have been public ceremonies in spaces we currently misidentify. The Great Bath might have been central to one of them, or our assumptions could be substantially wrong. The silence of the script requires humility. The same applies to gender. Terracotta female figurines cannot provide a complete map of women's status. Large houses cannot reveal household authority by themselves. Burials provide only fragments. Women worked. Men worked. Children worked and played. Craft roles may have been divided by gender in ways that vary by community. Textile production may have involved substantial household labor. Agricultural work almost certainly involved family participation. But reconstructing rigid gender rules from objects alone risks projecting later assumptions backward. Instead, the physical evidence allows glimpses. A fingerprint remains on wet clay, or develops on a skeleton from repetitive labor. A child's toy survives because it was fired in a kiln. A cooking pot blackens over repeated use. A staircase wears beneath thousands of feet. A drain is opened and cleared again and again. These traces bring us closer to the inhabitants than speculative lists of kings ever could. Their civilization becomes intimate. At a well, someone drew water thousands of times. At a threshold, generations stepped into the same courtyard. At a bead workshop, eyes strained over holes scarcely wider than a needle. At a kiln, craftspeople judged temperature without modern instruments. At a marketplace, weights turned arguments into measurable quantities. At a sealmaker's bench, someone carved symbols backward so that the impression would appear correctly. That final task is easy to underestimate. Many seals were carved in intaglio, so their impressions appeared raised and correctly oriented. The artisan had to conceptualize the finished image in reverse. Tiny signs required extraordinary control. Mistakes could ruin expensive steatite. After carving, seals were treated and fired to produce their characteristic appearance and hardness. These were not crude, bureaucratic tokens. They were precision objects combining administration, art, symbolism, and technology. Some had bosses with holes on their backs, allowing them to be handled or perhaps worn. Who possessed them? Merchants? Household heads? Officials? Institutions? Religious specialists? Different seals may have served different roles. Their impressions, called sealings, suggest practical uses involving goods and containers. But the animal imagery suggests identity, and symbolism mattered too. A modern passport, company logo, signature, religious emblem, and legal stamp all communicate different kinds of authority. An Indus seal may have combined categories we separate today, and beyond the seals stood mathematics in practical form. Standard weights reveal quantification. Architecture required measurement. Reservoir construction required estimating levels and volumes. Bead drilling required geometric control. Urban planning required surveying. None of that tells us whether Harappans possessed written mathematical texts. But complex applied measurement was embedded throughout their civilization. At Lothal, an ivory object marked at regular intervals has often been interpreted as part of a measuring scale. Other measuring devices and standardized units indicate concern with precision. The civilization made things fit. Its bricks fit conventions. Its weights fit systems. Its streets fit urban plans. Its drains fit gradients. Its reservoirs fit landscapes. Order itself appears almost as one of its signatures. But order should not be romanticized into social harmony. Standards can be maintained through cooperation. They can also be maintained through authority. Without texts, we cannot determine where Harappan institutions fell on that spectrum. A brick ratio does not tell us whether workers loved the system that required it. A clean drain does not reveal who had to clean it. A beautiful bead does not tell us whether its maker was wealthy, dependent, indebted, coerced, or respected. Archaeology reveals structures more readily than experiences. That is another reason the undeciphered script matters so much. Texts, even biased elite texts, can preserve conflict. Objects rarely complain. Nevertheless, the civilization's lack of massive commemorations of violence remains notable. Egyptian kings depicted enemies being struck. Mesopotamian rulers boasted of smashed cities. Later Assyrian kings described destruction in terrifying detail. Harappan seals show animals and signs. That difference in public representation may reflect profoundly different political ideologies. or it may reflect the restricted function of surviving Harappan writing. We cannot know which, but either way, the contrast is real. Another contrast lies in monumental construction. The Harappans absolutely possessed monumental architecture. Dholavira's fortifications and reservoirs were monumental. The Great Bath was monumental in civic significance. Large platforms and gateways required major labor. What they generally did not build, as far as surviving evidence shows, were gigantic structures devoted unmistakably to glorifying one ruler. Their monumentality was often infrastructural. Walls, platforms, water systems, public spaces. That is a different archaeological expression of organized power. And water repeatedly returns. At Mohenjo-daro, wells and drains. At Dholavira, reservoirs and channels. At other settlements, bathing areas, wells, and local water management features. Water shaped Indus life because geography demanded it. Rivers could sustain civilization and threaten it. Monsoons could create abundance and uncertainty. Floods fertilized land and destroyed buildings. Drought could turn settlement into migration. Harappan civilization was therefore never simply a civilization on a river. It was a civilization negotiating with water, sometimes controlling it, sometimes storing it, sometimes draining it, sometimes following it when it moved. That relationship eventually became central to the urbanization. The Indus itself is famously unstable. Mohenjo-daro experienced repeated flooding or flood-related sedimentation during its history. Communities rebuilt. Platforms were raised. Buildings accumulated vertically. Resilience worked for centuries. But resilience costs labor. Rebuilding requires resources. Maintaining urban systems requires population and surplus. If environmental difficulties increase at the same time trade contracts and populations disperse, recovery becomes harder. The civilizations, and therefore, likely involved interacting causes rather than a single killer. Climate change, river dynamics, shifting agriculture, changing trade, institutional fragmentation, demographic movement, regional adaptation, possibly local social conflict. Different combinations mattered in different places. That is less cinematic than invasion, but it is more historically convincing, and perhaps more extraordinary, because the civilization survived as an urban system for centuries precisely because it continuously adapted. Its mature phase alone lasted roughly 7 centuries. Its developmental roots extend thousands of years earlier. Its descendant traditions continued afterward. Measured on a human scale, 700 years is almost incomprehensible. Imagine a system of urban conventions beginning around the time of the European Middle Ages and continuing substantially intact into the present. Generations would be born knowing nothing else. Grandparents would teach standards inherited from grandparents who themselves inherited them from a distant past. Political circumstances could change repeatedly while basic cultural systems persisted. That is the scale of Harappan continuity. And yet eventually even deeply rooted systems end. By the later 2nd millennium BCE, the urban civilization recognizable through classic Harappan seals, writing, standardized weights, and great cities had disappeared. New archaeological cultures occupied the landscape. Indo-Aryan languages became increasingly important in northern South Asia. Vedic traditions developed and changed. iron technology eventually expanded, although it is important not to push widespread iron use too early into the late Harappan world. Earlier narratives sometimes linked late Harappan communities directly to an immediate Iron Age transition. In reality, iron became significant in different South Asian regions on different chronologies, with broader use developing during the later 2nd and early 1st millennium BCE. The Ganges Plain eventually supported new forms of settlement and, centuries later, another great wave of urbanization. By then, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro belonged to a forgotten age. No surviving Vedic text clearly says, "Here stood Mohenjo-daro." No later royal chronicle preserves its kings. The ancient names were gone. The script was unreadable. The cities became anonymous earth. And this produces one of the strangest historical facts about the Indus Civilization. Its rediscovery is part of its history because modern archaeology had to create the category through which we know it. Nobody in 1800 could write a history of the Indus Civilization comparable to the one we can attempt today. The civilization had been erased, not physically, but conceptually. Its bricks remained. Its objects remained. Its skeletons remained. Its streets remained. What disappeared was recognition. Then archaeology reunited the fragments. A seal from Harappa matched imagery at Mohenjo-daro. Weights matched. Bricks matched. Pottery matched. The script matched. Suddenly, two ruins became one civilization. Then dozens of ruins joined them. Then hundreds. Then networks emerged. Chronology deepened. Regional phases appeared. The lost world expanded across the map. And the more archaeologists discovered, the stranger its central mystery became. How could a civilization this large remain unknown for so long? Partly because it never left behind a decipherable textual tradition linking ancient names to modern places. Egyptian civilization remained visible through monuments towering above the landscape. Mesopotamian cities preserved vast cuneiform archives whose languages were eventually deciphered. Classical Greek and Roman texts survived through manuscript traditions. The Indus Civilization lost both advantages. Its architecture weathered into mounds. Its script could not be read. The result was historical disappearance. Today, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro are no longer invisible. Mohenjo-daro is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Dholavira has also received UNESCO World Heritage status. Museums preserve seals and artifacts. Archaeologists continue surveying settlements across India, Pakistan, and neighboring regions. Yet preservation has become its own crisis. Mohenjo-daro faces threats from salt, groundwater, erosion, temperature, rain, tourism, and the immense difficulty of conserving exposed mud and baked brick. Excavation itself can destroy what it reveals. A buried wall may survive millennia beneath protective soil. Once uncovered, wind, salt, and rain begin attacking it. Archaeologists therefore confront a paradox. To learn from a site, they expose it. To preserve it, they may need to leave it buried. Modern technology offers ways around part of this problem. Remote sensing can investigate landscapes without extensive digging. Magnetometry and ground-penetrating methods can identify buried structures under favorable conditions. Microscopic analysis can extract information from tiny samples. Digital mapping records architecture in detail. Satellite imagery can trace paleochannels. But there is no technology capable of recovering information already destroyed by looting, erosion, uncontrolled construction, or poorly documented early excavation. Context is archaeology's irreplaceable resource. A seal alone is beautiful. A seal found in a precisely documented room beside specific objects and stratigraphic layers is historical evidence. Remove the context, and half the story disappears. That is why newly discovered Harappan sites matter so much. They can answer questions the famous early excavations could not. Rakhigarhi has become especially important. Its size demonstrates that the civilization had major centers far east of the Indus itself. Burials there have contributed to bioarchaeological and genetic research. Other sites continue filling gaps between urban cores and countryside. Rather than discovering another Mohenjo-daro every year, modern archaeology often advances through apparently modest findings. A charred seed changes agricultural chronology. A tooth reveals childhood mobility. A sediment layer records flooding. A chemical signature identifies the geological source of a bead. A potsherd reveals residue from food. A microscopic fiber documents textile use. Each piece narrows the possibilities, and still the script resists. Computational analysis has entered the debate. Researchers examine sign frequencies, sequence patterns, positional regularities, and comparisons with known writing systems. Machine learning can search combinations far faster than a human, but computation cannot manufacture missing evidence. If we do not know the language, if inscriptions are extremely short, and if no bilingual text exists, a computer faces the same fundamental underdetermination as a scholar. It can identify patterns. It cannot magically prove what a sign meant to a person living in Harappa 4,000 years ago. The breakthrough, if it comes, may therefore require archaeology more than computing. A longer inscription, a bilingual text, a securely identified proper name, an archive. Until that moment, every seal is a locked door. And perhaps that is why the civilization has become so compelling. Egypt speaks through pharaohs. Mesopotamia speaks through kings, merchants, priests, school children, accountants, and poets. The Indus Civilization speaks primarily through design. Its bricks say that standards mattered. Its drains say that urban water management mattered. Its weights say that measurement mattered. Its workshops say that specialization mattered. Its imported materials say that connection mattered. Its reservoirs say that adaptation mattered. Its seals say that identity and information mattered, even though we cannot read them. And its disappearance says that no urban system, however sophisticated, exists independently of its environment and networks. There is one final misconception worth removing. The Indus Civilization was not an inexplicable miracle appearing fully formed around 2600 BCE. We began thousands of years earlier at Mehrgarh precisely because mature Harappan society becomes understandable only through its deep history. Agriculture developed gradually. Settlements grew gradually. Craft specialization developed gradually. Trade networks expanded gradually. Regional communities interacted gradually. Urban planning emerged from earlier experiments. Then the mature phase represented an extraordinary intensification and standardization of processes with long foundations. The end worked in the opposite direction. Standardization loosened. Networks contracted. Cities dispersed. Regional differences strengthened. Writing disappeared. Again, there was no magical switch. The civilization formed through integration and ended through regionalization. Seen in that long perspective, its history is not simply rise, golden age, collapse. It is convergence, urbanization, adaptation, transformation. That is a much more human story. At Mehrgarh, the first farmers could not imagine Mohenjo-daro. At Mohenjo-daro, an urban household could not imagine archaeologists excavating its bathroom 4,000 years later. A merchant pressing a unicorn seal into clay could not imagine that future civilizations would understand the chemistry of the seal, but not the meaning of its inscription. A builder at Dholavira could not know that the reservoir being cut into the landscape would survive the language spoken around it. A family leaving a declining city could not know that the abandonment would one day be called the collapse of civilization. People rarely know when they're living at the boundary of an archaeological period. They simply live. And somewhere around 2500 BCE, if we could travel into one of these cities without the distortions of modern expectation, perhaps what would surprise us most would be its normality. We might arrive expecting mystery. Its inhabitants would see a working city. We would stare at the script. They would read it. We would marvel at the drains. They might complain that one was blocked. We would photograph a seal. A merchant might regard it as paperwork. We would treat a carnelian bead as a museum treasure. Someone might bargain over its price. We would search the skyline for a palace. A resident might point us toward institutions we have never learned how to recognize. We would ask who their king was. They might answer with a title we could not translate. Or perhaps they would find the question itself strange. We would ask which gods they worshipped. They might give names lost forever. We would ask why the unicorn mattered. And for the first and only time, the answer would be obvious. That unbridgeable distance is the heart of the Indus story. Archaeology has recovered an extraordinary amount, but it has not recovered the civilization's own explanation of itself. And because of that, Harappan history must remain balanced between achievement and uncertainty. Its achievements do not need exaggeration. We do not need to claim that every large building was a granary. We do not need to call Lothal's basin a dockyard without acknowledging debate. We do not need to declare the Great Bath a temple. We do not need to turn the horned seal figure into Shiva with certainty. We do not need to describe society as perfectly egalitarian simply because no royal palace has been identified. We do not need an invading army to make its ending dramatic. The evidence itself is enough. More than 4,000 years ago, millions of human lives unfolded within a cultural world stretching across an enormous portion of South Asia. Its farmers understood radically different ecological zones. Its engineers built reservoirs in deserts and drains beneath crowded streets. Its craftspeople transformed stone into beads carried to foreign lands. Its merchants participated in networks reaching across the Arabian Sea. Its builders reproduced standards across enormous distances. Its administrators or traders employed a symbol system still unreadable today. Its cities maintained complex infrastructures without leaving us a single confidently identified emperor. And when conditions changed, its people adapted rather than simply vanishing. The great urban centers diminished. The countryside persisted. Populations moved. Cultures mixed. Old techniques survived in altered forms. New languages entered the region. New traditions developed. The Indus world ceased to exist as the integrated civilization archaeologists recognize, but the human history continued without interruption. Centuries became millennia. The cities disappeared beneath the ground. Then a railway age began tearing ancient bricks from forgotten mounds. Explorers noticed strange ruins. Archaeologists uncovered unfamiliar seals. Two cities were connected. A lost Bronze Age civilization returned to history. And now we stand in a peculiar position. We know more about the Indus Civilization than any generation since antiquity. And yet its most basic secrets remain beyond us. Somewhere among several hundred signs may be words for water, grain, city, family, god, ruler, merchant, river, and home. Perhaps the names Harappa and Mohenjo-daro once bore are already sitting in museum cases. Perhaps the name of a person who lived 4,000 years ago has been photographed, cataloged, measured, and published hundreds of times without anyone realizing that it is a name. Perhaps one tiny seal contains the answer to a question scholars have been asking for a century. We can see the signs. We simply cannot hear the language behind them. And so the civilization that placed so much value on order leaves us with one of ancient history's greatest unresolved puzzles. It was enormous, yet we do not know whether it was an empire. It was organized, yet its rulers are unknown. It used writing, yet its words are silent. It built major cities, yet did not fill them with obvious monuments to kings. It traded internationally, yet its own name survives only indirectly, perhaps in the Mesopotamian word Moloha. It declined, yet there is no single destruction event that explains its end. It disappeared as an urban system, yet its people did not disappear. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Indus civilization is that its mystery is not created by a lack of evidence. There is evidence everywhere. Kilometers of ancient settlement, thousands of artifacts, hundreds of signs, reservoirs, wells, drains, workshops, cemeteries, seeds, bones, beads, weights, seals, streets, entire cities. What is missing is the voice that connects them. Until that voice is recovered, the bricks have to speak for the people. And the story those bricks tell begins thousands of years before the cities, when farming communities learned to survive between mountains, rivers, plains, and deserts. It gathers momentum as villages became towns and distant communities became connected. It reaches its extraordinary height when cities from Sindh to Gujarat and Punjab to Haryana participated in shared systems of construction, commerce, craft, measurement, and symbolism. It crosses the sea aboard Bronze Age trading vessels. It appears in Mesopotamian records under the mysterious name Meluha. It passes through workshops where craftspeople drilled holes through carnelian with astonishing precision. It descends into the Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro. It climbs beside the reservoirs of Dholavira. It follows carts across dusty roads and boats along vanished waterways. It enters houses through private courtyards. It disappears beneath covered drains. It is stamped into clay with animals whose meanings we have forgotten. Then the monsoons become less dependable. Rivers shift. Trade changes. Cities contract. People move. The standardized world fragments. The script falls silent. And the people who inherited that world carry pieces of it into new communities and new ages. Thousands of years later, archaeologists dig downward and encounter a civilization nobody expected to find. The first seal emerges, then another. The signs match, the bricks match, the cities match, and an entire lost chapter of human history returns. But not completely. Not yet. Because somewhere between the first farmers of Mehrgarh and the final Harappan craftspeople who stopped carving those mysterious signs lies a story we can reconstruct only from fragments. It is not the story of a civilization that failed. Every civilization eventually changes beyond recognition. It is the story of one of humanity's earliest and most sustained experiments in large-scale urban life. An experiment conducted without pyramids towering above the plains, without surviving royal chronicles, without giant statues announcing the faces of conquerors. Its greatest monuments were often things meant to work. A reservoir holding precious water, a well serving a neighborhood, a precisely proportioned wall, a street directing movement, a drain carrying wastewater away, a weight making an exchange measurable, a seal making identity recognizable, a city turning thousands of strangers into participants in a shared system. 4,000 years later, the people are gone. Their language is gone. The wooden doors have rotted. The textiles have vanished. The markets are silent. The wells are empty. The ships no longer approach the coastlines they once knew. The rivers themselves have changed, but the cities remain. And beneath the mystery, beneath every debate over seals, rulers, religion, migration, rivers, and decline, that may be the most powerful fact of all. The Indus Civilization endured long enough to create a world recognizable across generations and across enormous distances. Then it transformed so completely that even its name was lost. And still, after millennia of silence, its streets tell us that the people who walk them planned for tomorrow. Its reservoirs tell us that they understood scarcity. Its workshops tell us that they valued skill. Its weights tell us that strangers could agree on standards. Its trade goods tell us that oceans and deserts did not isolate them. Its houses tell us that urban civilization was experienced not only through rulers and monuments, but through families, work, water, food, privacy, craft, and routine. And its undeciphered signs leave one promise hanging over the entire story. The possibility that the civilization has not surrendered its final secret. A future excavation may uncover the missing text. A bilingual inscription may someday emerge from a port where Harappans met people from another literate world. A longer archive may remain buried beneath an unexplored mound. A breakthrough may give sounds to signs that have been silent for 40 centuries. And if that happens, the transformation would be immediate. The anonymous builders might acquire names. The unknown cities might recover their ancient titles. The animals on the seals might finally reveal what they represented. The political system might stop being a debate conducted almost entirely through architecture. The Great Bath might acquire a purpose. Meluham might tell us whether that foreign word referred to the civilization we have spent a century reconstructing. For the first time since the Bronze Age, the Indus people might speak in something approaching their own voice. Until then, history has to end where the evidence does. Not with a legendary king, not with a final battle, not with a conquering army marching through burning cities, not with one dramatic day when an entire civilization vanished, but with millions of quieter decisions made across generations. To repair or not repair, to remain or move, to plant one crop instead of another, to trade locally rather than overseas, to reuse an old building, to abandon a standard, to stop carving a sign, to settle beside another river, to carry familiar techniques into an unfamiliar world. That was how one of the earliest great urban civilizations passed out of its mature form, not into nothingness, into history. And beneath the plains and ancient riverbeds of South Asia, much of that history is still waiting.